We have spent Sundays in January taking a tough look at the racial challenges we face as a religious community and the false dualisms that distort beyond recognition the oneness of humanity. Dismantling racism is no easy feat and not for the faint of heart. So let's take a theological break and move on to a lighter topic: sin. I'll confess, it seems that I have returned from the winter holidays with a muddled mind, spiritually at least. Now, that's usually not a bad thing, but it is unsettling. I'd like to blame my befuddlement on my spiritual community, but my experience tells me that I am the one who has changed. This is the difficult part of the spiritual journey, one so accurately compared to being in the wilderness. I'm lost and cannot find my way home. I'll also confess, each time I enter the wilderness, it gets a little easier, for I know what's on the other side. Like so many folks on January 6th in Washington, D.C., perhaps I wouldn't recognize my old spiritual home if I found it. I wouldn't want to live there anymore. It's forever uninhabitable, a spiritual wasteland. Please don't think for a minute that I dare compare my lot with those trapped on Capitol Hill that fateful day. But I am finally able to shed tears over democracy's attempted assassination. I am also reminded that weeping lasts for a night, but joy comes in the morning. As preacher Tony Campolo always says at Eastertide, it's Friday, but Sunday's coming. We are promised both a time to laugh and a time to cry. It was my time to cry. The vivid images weren't enough. The TV news anchor couldn't elicit tears. The occasional epiphanies of fundamental meaning in the midst of tragedy did not send me running for the Kleenex. Then last week it hit home for reasons unknown. I had read a piece by Christopher Rice, the son of celebrated author Anne Rice, which got my ducks in a flow. You see, Christopher's dad is, or perhaps was, buried in New Orleans. The water table is low, so bodies are entombed above the ground. During the ravages of Katrina, the writer could not get the picture of his father's cast being carried by currents to places unknown in a wilderness of water. Rice went on to describe the spirituality of place that contributes to the uniqueness that is or was New Orleans. The vibes there are real. The city celebrates both decadence and the days of saints. One was the yin to the other's yang, the circle completed only when division is defeated. It's all in how you see it. Now wait, it gets even better. God and the devil are one and the same. Dionysus and Mother Teresa share a balcony off Bourbon Street. Communion wine flows freely from temple to brothel, freeing its communicants from false dichotomies invented by false gods to keep truth at bay and disunity close by. The directive, go to hell, is an invitation for salvation. Now stay with me here, for what I am describing is nothing less than the very nature of sin itself. Taken on these terms, sin is basic to human nature and inseparable from life. It is part of the ebb and flow that travels both within our veins and upon sod underfoot. It is the foundation for faith building and the motivation for social justice. It is both good and evil. Most of us have been taught quite the opposite. We tend to understand good and evil as different states of being. We categorize and separate out the good guys from the bad guys. Also, when we label something good, we are saying it is not way out there at the other end of the spectrum where evil resides. Now, these divisions may be necessary to logic, but they are defied by nature. The acknowledgement of the interconnected web of life confirms a blurring of the line between humans and animals and plants. One flows into the other, creating a seamless whole and an encircling holiness. While dissection might aid in the study of nature, it also may overshadow nature's overarching continuity and thus damage its overwhelming spirituality. Nature challenges G.K. Chesterton's assertion that morality, like art, consists of drawing a line somewhere. In nature, there are no straight lines or sharp distinctions. Now, we may impose them for the sake of clarity or communication, but that does not make them real. Who among us can tell where the mind stops and the body begins? Who can defend the division of God into three persons? Who truly knows when life begins, or for that matter, when it ends? Cut and dice if you must, but such dichotomies are blatantly false. The natural world both models and mirrors the religious realm. It is difficult to determine where one begins and the other ends because they are the same thing. Most religions that have stood the test of time affirm or at least admit this, along with a corollary truth. Human nature and sin are also inseparable. To lose sin from the liberal religious lexicon is to indulge in intellectual hubris and to pretend a moral superiority that ultimately betrays our irrelevance in the postmodern world. Perhaps our movement stays small not because our message is mostly unpopular, but because it is partially wrong. When it comes to sin, at least, our silence on the subject doesn't square with modern life's travails. The unbridled optimism that characterized the early Unitarians and Universalists and that intended to make the world a better place for all people to live a fully human life, that failed when we took sin out of the equation. Surely some balance was needed, since most people at that time were fixated on a fated future that stretched beyond what we call death. Our UU forebears were right to suggest that the Holy's unconditional love trumped the church's behavioral scorecard of rights and wrongs, do's and don'ts. In an effort to counter Calvinism and tell the story, a redemptive story of radical inclusion, the liberal religious chapter on sin fell into neglect, and it was eventually dropped from the canon. As Rollo May points out in his book, Love and Will, not to see the demonic is to make the demonic. This intentional editing can leave one blindsided to evil and therefore incapable to respond religiously. Unlike so many who came of age in the 1960s and 70s. I don't love everybody. How boring is that? And while I do not disagree at all with colleagues who espouse the inherent worth and dignity of every person, unlike many of them, I measure worth and dignity in degrees. I guess I'm too much of a sinner to deem everyone a saint. And I believe it is important to know our enemies. If we don't know them, if we pretend we have no enemies, instead only having emotionally challenging, politically incorrect, and morally differently abled friends in a multicultural world, we won't stop them. In fact, we feel we don't have the right to stop them. It's not our call to make. And soon we do not see them at all. By giving them anonymity, we give them the opportunity to act on their fatal attractions and greedy ambitions. Again, Rollo May is helpful here. He observed as the good citizens of Britain and the United States turned a blind eye to sin that rendered them incapable of recognizing the evil of Adolf Hitler in the 1930s. Nobody could be so evil. Well, maybe. History tells us otherwise, however, and I am sure that many of you can tell us the same as well. The Unitarian Universalist minister Duncan Littlefair tells of sitting in a church in Toronto in 1936, listening to a Jewish rabbi talk about the coffins that came back sealed after relatives had disappeared in the dead of night. At the time, Littlefair exclaimed, "It can't be true. No one could do that. We are blinded by our own aspirations and ideals." Today, we needn't be blind or indifferent to the ravages of war. The unholy matrimony of media and government ensures that we do not see images that might disturb us out of our inertia. Talk about sin. The whole world was watching when a mostly American invasion of Iraq and the messy obliteration of Iraqis, and now we have figured out who has replaced Saddam Hussein as Hitler's understudy. It's Kim Jong-un. It's Vladimir Putin. Let the nuclear battles begin. Almost 70, 80 years later, I can still hear Reverend Littlefair's lament. It can't be true. No one could do that. We are blinded by our own aspirations and ideals. Now, today, we need eyes to see and ears to hear. We must acknowledge the fact of sin and recognize the persistence of sin. And what is sin? What is sin? Sin is the intentional separation of that which has been declared both holy and whole. Why are we so distant from our allies as well as our enemies? Is there any connection between the proliferation of nuclear programs abroad and the citizens' border patrols at home? Is it not apparent that we are a first-class nation made up of mostly second-class citizens? What exactly is sin? Sin is also separation from empowerment. It attempts to hoard all that is holy and whole. Never have we as a nation been so divided. I'm not just talking about the political realm, for separation has permeated our personal lives to the point that we no longer have faith in faith. Nearly no one takes Kierkegaard's leap of faith anymore, a leap that reunites body and spirit. What is sin? Sin is separation from ourselves. It defiles all that is holy and whole. It is as if the very force of creativity has come to a standstill. Sameness has left the canvas without brushstrokes, the staff without eighth notes, the screen without focus, and the stage without floodlights. Meanwhile, we delight in mediocrity and confuse porno with Picasso. What is sin? Sin is separation from the imagination. It limits all that is holy and whole. It is time for religious communities to tear down our own fences, those artificial lines we draw, even in liberal houses of worship. These are lines that separate the sheep from the goats, the wheat from the tares, the saved from the lost. We cannot begin to repair a world torn asunder without presenting a united front. What is sin? Sin is separation from each other. It mocks community by destroying all that is holy and whole. And the very force of creativity mumbles something about this being as good as it gets. No offense intended, creator, imaginer, but that's not up to you. This goes back to an ancient offer that has never been rescinded, called free will, which allows for the sin that makes us human and the truth that makes us free. We close with the words of the Irish poet James Stephens. Good and bad are in my heart, but I cannot tell you, for they never are apart. Which is the better of the two? I am this, I am the other, and the devil is my brother. But my father, he is God, and my mother is the sod. So I shelter, love, and hate, like twin brothers in a nest. Separations persist. Dualisms divide. By faith together, we can encounter the sacred profane dichotomy first and foremost by sharing our redemptive story of radical inclusion in a world made indifferent with its abhorrence of difference. Who knows? One day soon we may even be able to restore our hope. The vision of one world under one love, it's within our reach. I can almost taste it. It seeks the warmth of the sun and the light of day. By faith together, may we fulfill the promise of our faith that one day all will be one to the glory of life.